My name is Sarah Tarnico, and I'm Suicide Prevention Coordinator at the Counseling Center. I first met Davis about a year and a half ago, and she has been instrumental in the development of Tide Against Suicide and the student group. Davis is well known on campus for her hard work ethic and her empathy and her passion for advocating for mental health issues. She's particularly interested in reducing the stigma surrounding mental illness. Davis is about to graduate in May, and I am so sad about it, but I know that she's going to go on to do really great things in her life. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Davis Silver.
When someone has diabetes or cancer or just underwent a major surgery, family and friends flood the hospital with flowers and warm wishes. On the contrary, when someone has a mental illness, such as bipolar, schizophrenia, or psychopathy, friends and family do not flood the hospital with warm wishes and flowers, but rather these individuals are shunned from society. But diabetes and mental illness are both lifelong and biological illnesses. They are treated with science, medication, and therapy. Diabetes is not a choice, just like mental illness is not a choice. So why can we fight for individuals with diabetes, but we can't bring ourselves to fight for individuals with mental illness? Why do we as a society have compassion for individuals with diabetes, but don't have compassion for individuals with mental illness? Do I really have compassion for individuals with mental illness? Before I begin, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Davis Silver, and I'm a senior from New York City, majoring in marketing and psychology with a minor in the Blunt Scholars Program. My proudest accomplishment on campus and in life thus far has been helping to found Tide Against Suicide, along by Sarah, who you just heard from. I love cats, I love Queer Eye, Schitt's Creek, and I do shamelessly love TikTok. The reason I am talking to you about this topic tonight is because my older brother was diagnosed with bipolar disorder 3 years ago. He just graduated from Vanderbilt University, and his recovery is definitely still ongoing. But because of his diagnosis, I learned that I would have to come to terms with some very difficult and very stigmatized topics. I am still struggling to truly find compassion for individuals with mental illness, but I hope to make it a little easier for you to start that journey tonight. So let's begin. What do you get when you cross a mentally ill loner with a society that abandons him and treats him like trash? The Joker. I am not trying to say that anyone deserves or is responsible for what the Joker did to society. But when you take the Joker out of the dramatized nature of Marvel films and look at him more as a metaphor for a larger issue, his story teaches valuable lessons to society about the treatment and lack of compassion people have for individuals with mental illness. Personally, when I watched this most recent film, I felt heard, understood, and respected for the first time as someone who knows someone with a mental illness, which is why I'm referencing him tonight. Throughout my presentation, I'm going to pull quotes from the Joker movie that touched me and resonated with me on the topics that I've had to come to terms with in regards to finding compassion for individuals with mental illness. So these are the 3 ways I find compassion for individuals with mental illness, and the 3 things I do struggle with. First, I'm going to talk about the biology behind mental illness. Second, I'm going to discuss the tragedy of the law and regulations that fail to protect individuals with mental illness. And third, I'm going to talk about the dreaded media and their role in the stigma and fear. So first, let's talk about the biology. The worst part of having a mental illness is that people expect you to behave as if you don't. The Joker. Before my brother's diagnosis, and even now, I truly struggle to accept the fact that mental illness is a biological illness. It's not an easy thing to come to terms with. And if you think you've come to terms with it, you're probably lying to yourself. My parents constantly have to tell me it's an illness, not a choice. But this quote resonated with me because it questioned how I view my brother's diagnosis and how I view my brother apart from his diagnosis. I can't expect my brother to behave as if he doesn't have a mental illness, and neither should society. Let's take schizophrenia as an example, an illness in which people experience delusions, hallucinations, and disordered thinking that impairs daily functioning and is disabling to some. But schizophrenia is not a choice, it's a result of biology. People with schizophrenia release an excessive amount of dopamine in response to an amphetamine challenge, aka people with schizophrenia do not have as much amphetamine. But why do these dopamine releases make someone think that they're being tracked by the CIA, for example? In a normal individual, dopamine is responsible for providing an internal thought or external stimulus with prominence and significance. It's ultimately an attention-getting device. But in an individual with schizophrenia who has an increased amount of this dopamine release, they provide an inappropriate amount of prominence and significance to otherwise insignificant events and perceptions, which ultimately leads to paranoia and psychosis. Chemicals control our emotions, but we cannot control the chemicals that are released in our brains. I can't ask my brother to control the chemicals released in his brain, and expecting him to do so means that I don't truly believe he has an illness in the first place. So, people with schizophrenia also have brain abnormalities. Functional MRIs have consistently shown that people with schizophrenia have a mess up in their auditory processing system and an increased activation of Broca's area, which is where internal speech is produced, and certain temporal and subcortical areas, which is where external speech is produced. In someone with schizophrenia, their auditory processing system does not process internal thoughts as self-generated, and rather processes them as if they were derived from some external stimulus, which ultimately leads people to hear voices, per se. So, as a society, we can't expect individuals with mental illness to behave as if they do not have a mental illness, because that's not possible. But rather, we should find compassion and even more so respect for the illness that they are fighting but can't control. Which leads me to talk about the tragedy of law. Is it just me, or is it getting crazier out there? The Joker. Throughout my brother's treatment process, I have had to learn that the law is really not on your side if you have a mental illness. Before my brother's diagnosis, I genuinely believed that if you had a mental illness and you were not getting treatment or getting better, then it's your fault. But that's not the case. This quote resonated with me because it reminded me of what little access people actually have to mental health treatment, and that's because of the law. It's important to remember that mental illness is often accompanied with another illness called anosognosia, which literally means lack of knowledge of disease. This is by far the hardest thing to come to terms with when you know someone with a mental illness. The frontal lobe of our brains is responsible for updating our self-image. It organizes new information prevalent to who we are as human beings. But in someone with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, this part of their brain is severely damaged. And anywhere from 57 to 98% of people with schizophrenia have anosognosia, which means they don't think that they have schizophrenia. So when I yell across the house at my brother, "Why don't you just take your medication?" that is ineffective and detrimental to his treatment process because he does not think that he has an illness, and therefore he blames me for getting so upset. But you would think that the laws and the regulations would take this into account when treating someone with mental illness, but they really don't. The HIPAA law is meant to protect the medical information of individuals, but it also limits what a doctor can say to a patient's family. For someone who does not think that they're sick in the first place, this law often results in times where family and friends of someone with a mental illness cannot communicate with healthcare providers. This is a detriment to the loved one. I can think of so many times my parents have been worried sick trying to contact my brother's doctors to tell them about his past hospitalizations, the medications he's on, etc., but they couldn't, and that led to ineffective treatment. Involuntary hospitalizations are also detrimental to the treatment of someone with mental illness. State laws vary, but all set very strict controls, limiting involuntary hospitalizations to times when someone is in imminent danger to themselves or others. In other words, unless the person is hurting themselves or actively hurting another person, they don't have to go to the hospital. So when my brother thinks that he's a god from an ulterior universe that he created in his head, he doesn't have to go to the hospital if he doesn't want to. Involuntary hospitalizations are also restricted to a few days and make it impossible to treat someone against their will unless a court orders otherwise, which they rarely do. But someone who is sick and doesn't believe that they're sick are not going to take themselves to the hospital, and they're not going to approve treatment. So the law is really not on the side of individuals with mental illness. And it's getting crazier out there because people don't have access to mental health treatment. For my brother's case, I can't be angry at him for not taking his medication, but rather I need to find compassion and patience for his treatment process, because most of the time, if he's not getting better, it's probably not his fault. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the media's role in the stigma and fear. You wouldn't get it, the Joker. I can say with 100% confidence, I did not understand mental illness until I knew someone affected by it. And for that, I blame the media. It's nearly impossible to find compassion for individuals with mental illness when the media entices such a massive fear and stigma around it. Even the Joker movie itself encourages this fear and stigma. The Joker is driven to madness, which leads to violence, which leads to murder, which is a massive misconception. When I tell people that my older brother has a mental illness, I fear that they're going to think of him as dangerous. My family and I hate to watch movies and read the news surrounding someone with mental illness because the majority of the time they have it grossly and disrespectfully wrong. In reality, people with mental illness are not only less likely to commit violent crimes, they're actually more likely to be victimized by violent crimes. And even more so, they're more likely to harm themselves. And that's where we need to find compassion. The media likes to focus on the individual with mental illness, rather than looking at mental illness as a societal issue and touching on the points that I've stated tonight. This is why much of society blames the individual for having a mental illness, rather than finding compassion for them. The media also overtly overgeneralizes mental illness, and every single person with a specific mental health condition is expected to portray the exact same symptoms. So everyone with depression will attempt suicide, and every single person with schizophrenia will hallucinate. In reality, common symptoms of schizophrenia include decreased motivation and poverty of speech. But the media doesn't like to talk about these things because it's just not as entertaining. The Shining, while a fantastic film, makes people with mental illness look deranged, dangerous, and possessed, which leads to stigmatization, stereotyping, social rejection, and discrimination, and is the reason I don't like to tell people that my brother has a mental illness, because I know that they look at him in the same light. The media is also responsible for making mental illness always seem negative. Studies show that the media is the public's primary source for information about bipolar and schizophrenia. But the media serves to distance individuals with mental illness from the rest of society by making them out to be incompetent, slovenly, childish, different looking, dangerous, and undeserving. Well, my brother just graduated from Vanderbilt University, so I really don't think he's that incompetent. It breaks my heart to think of how many people view individuals with mental illness as a detriment to society and as undeserving of our love, compassion, and kindness. Imagine being an individual with a mental illness that you can't control, knowing that society views you as a detriment and as undeserving of love and kindness. In reality, individuals with mental illness have brought us some of our greatest works. If we really canceled everyone with mental illness, we would not have the writings of F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, or Virginia Woolf, to name a few. We would not be able to listen to Beethoven, and we would not be able to revel at the art of Van Gogh. As a society, we cannot honor these individuals while lacking compassion for the people in our everyday lives who have these same illnesses. Society is blinded to the reality of mental illness by media. And people like to forget that individuals with mental illness have feelings and they have emotions. And they deserve compassion, patience, and respect as much as someone with diabetes. So, do you really have compassion for individuals with mental illness? I'm still struggling with it, and I can't say that I'm 100% there yet either. But I hope throughout this talk and the points I've made about biology and law and media, you're better equipped to find those compassion for those individuals. Because it could be your neighbor, could be your best friend, it could be your professor, it could be your mom, and it could be you. No one is truly safe from this. So it's time we start treating mental illness like an actual illness and start treating these human beings like actual human beings. Thank you. I also want to do a PSA to Students Tied Against Suicide, which is a new organization under Tied Against Suicide. If you would like to get involved, please text me at this number.